Yo, what's good everybody? You got Sketch here and welcome back to the channel. And on today's episode we're taking a look at Ghost Pilots for the Neo-Geo, developed and published by SNK, releasing simultaneously to the home and to the arcade in 1991. I remember first seeing this game on Nick Arcade as a kid, and even then it looked brutal considering none of the contestants ever passed that particular challenge when this game came up. Playing it again years later, it's plain to see why that happened, considering this vertical shoot 'em up is not one for the faint of heart. As you make your way through the enemy occupation during World War II, it pulls no punches and throws you to the action immediately, and also is ready to body you just as quickly. Before we take off, let's check out the story. During World War II, after numerous fleets perished while fighting for their respective countries, an ominous general has initiated a two-prong attack by air and by ground. Two pilots, Tom Phillips and Charlie Stingley, embark on their seaplanes to launch their counter-assault against the Axis forces head-on. Whenever their story is retold, they're referred to as the Ghost Pilots. The title sequence is about all the exposition you're going to get here, but know your mission will be intense and your skills tested. Gameplay-wise, you've got a vertical 2D shoot 'em up with a pretty conventional feel and aesthetic. You'll cruise through three sections broken up by fleets of either airborne or a mixture of air-to-ground enemies before taking on the general himself at the finale. The paths are broken up into a handful of stages each with varying difficulty. Once you pick your crush bomb of choice, you're off to fight the Axis, and they're ready to take you out of the skies. You've got a standard shot and a crush bomb that will cover different blast radius depending on what you pick, and these double as damage output and a temporary shield when things are going ape. And Ghost Pilots waste no time before throwing a good amount of gunfire and enemies in your face. Your sprite is pretty large and so is your hitbox, though your plane is pretty nimble even in the absence of speed upgrades. You can upgrade your standard shot and stack up bombs, but one hit and you lose it all. Enemies aside from shooting at you will fly into you constantly, especially the blue bombers that home in on you until you shoot them down. This game is out for blood when it comes to some of the enemy behaviors. Shot patterns aren't the most difficult part of surviving this onslaught. Surprisingly, it'll be enemies slamming into you unless you cut their ranks down or avoid them long enough they leave the screen. Larger and mid-range enemies can also fake you out with their fire patterns that track your position, as well as popcorn if you shoot certain bullet types. So trying to stay on the swivel will keep you flying, but knowing where to be on screen is just as important. Ghost Pilots also has several difficulty spikes throughout the campaign, and it feels like a game that's meant for two-player co-op. There are points on a few stages where you're just grossly outnumbered and outgunned if you're solo. Not to say it can't be done, but the amount of enemies can get pretty hectic here. Bombs can help out in a pinch to give yourself a little bit of breathing room, but having those for boss encounters are a massive help. You've got infinite continues and you respawn right where you leave off with no checkpoint system, but this game is still difficult, especially on the first few fresh runs. Considering the amount of firepower you'll want to have to get through this mission, you might want to turn the rapid fire on, since the enemy will not take it easy on you. Believe it or not, people have done one coin clears of this, so with enough patience and practice, it's possible. But keep in mind this game is long, like almost an hour long. So this is one of the shoot 'em ups that's in it for the long haul, much like Capcom's Varth, which would release the following year. Graphics wise, there's some pretty interesting stuff here, like the scaling effects, which you'll see a good bit of during the run. While the levels themselves don't have a lot of dynamic scaling effects, enemy sprites do. Enemies will fly into the screen from various viewpoints and angles, and that part looks pretty dope here. As far as animations and making use of the MVS hardware for an early entry, this is pretty solid. There's a lot of fluid animation, and that was really remarkable for the time, and even with a simple aesthetic with graphics design, it pulls a saturated palette of color and has some nice layering between the visual planes. Environments have a good bit of detail, and textures are all pretty pronounced with a similar style to the 1940 series, while weaving in some more modern engineered designs with the boss characters. You'll see some pretty neat mechanical prototype monstrosities here with the boss spanning several screens, and if you're familiar with shoot 'em ups, the fire patterns will be recognizable. Enemy designs mostly stay grounded in the reality of aircraft and weaponry of the era, though the bosses are more fantastical creations that are as menacing as they are deadly. The sprite animation in general is really one of the strongest suits of the game, with its highly detailed renders of explosions by air as well as underwater. Enemy flying animations are also pretty sick to see on screen, and adds to the element of where's the enemy gonna land in regard to the plane you're on. Again, no pun intended. The attention to detail here is pretty good, from the explosions to the battered aircraft struggling to stay in the skies. The artwork is pretty killer here. Also, everything happening on screen, even the hectic parts, it never really gets bogged down too much. For shoot 'em ups released in 1991, Ghost Pilots falls somewhere in the middle amongst some of the heavies from Capcom, Irem, and Konami of the same year. Graphically, it falls in line, doing some cutting-edge stuff while not pushing the boundaries too much considering what released around it. 1991 was a big year for games in general, and this one stuck out well enough to be noticed amongst a lot of healthy competition inside and out of the genre. Sound-wise, it's mostly good with some serious crunch to the audio design. Every explosion feels weighty, and the gunfire all sounds pretty crispy. The sound of the engine propeller is also a nice touch that even cuts out as you get shot down, which is a nice attention to detail. Aside from that, the audio is pretty standard, and the main sound effect you'll hear often is the continue countdown timer. The soundtrack does have a few nice builders on it, as well as several tracks that embody the wartime fanfare of the era it's based in. Papaya, also known as Masahiko Hataya, composed the music for Ghost Pilots along with several other SNK titles like Last Resort, The Super Spy, and the Shock Troopers games, just to name a few. There's a few solid tunes that cook, and it keeps up pretty well with the intensity of the action. Even though not every track bangs, for the most part it's a pretty good balance of hype and sinister. Overall, Ghost Pilots is a pretty decent shoot 'em up even with its few shortcomings. For what's there, you get a lengthy shooter that will test your skills, especially if you're playing it solo. For one of SNK's numerous shoot 'em up efforts, it's not bad, but it does have some issues that can detract from the experience, like its at times unbalanced difficulty. Don't get me wrong, it can be a fun one to clear for shoot 'em up fans, but it's certainly going to make you work for it. The sound and graphics are definitely the stronger side of the game, but for what it's worth, you can have some fun with it, and the best advice I could give you is to let that turbo fire rip and bring a friend if you can. Ghost Pilots gets a 7.5 out of 10 and comes recommended to shoot 'em up fans and fans of arcade ports. It's this solid even off of SNK hardware. This is a fairly divisive title in their catalogs. While some praise it for the action, others slam it for the either excess or lack of difficulty. I'd say it's an alright one, considering that there's far worse shoot 'em ups they can play besides this one, and I got an example of a terrible shoot 'em up coming in the near future. Ghost Pilots, while maybe not the best, does have some good to offer up for shoot 'em up fans, and fans of the more grounded 1940 style games. This is available for Neo-Geo, MVS, and AES hardware, as well as the Neo-Geo CD. It's also available on the Nintendo Switch, PS4, Xbox One, and Series X. It's a relatively inexpensive digital download, so if these kinds of games strike your fancy, give it a look. And I thank you again if you made it this far into the video. If you find these videos helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad to use it as a resource. Check back often. We'll have more reviews and commentaries coming up in the near future, but until then, take it easy and stay safe out there. I'll see you on the next one.